Hello, everyone. So we should be live right now. So let me know, please, in the chat if you can hear me clearly and if you can see the slide. I will wait a few seconds. So please confirm in the chat that you can hear me clearly. Yes, thank you, Hassan, for confirming. Thank you very much. So I want to welcome you today to our exciting webinar, which is titled 5 Steps to Prepare for an Audit, the Path to Temperature Compliance. And as the title suggests, the purpose of this webinar is to give you the knowledge and confidence you need to conquer temperature compliance audits. And the presenters today will be Jakob Konradsson and Adam Hartman. We had a last-minute change in the speaker, and instead of Arsalan, we will have Adam joining us today. And the session will be around 60 minutes, and it will include a Q&A session at the end. So please be ready with questions. After the webinar, if you stay until the end of the lecture, we will provide you with a free certificate of attendance sponsored by our event partner, UPRI, and you will get it within several days. And as you might know, we aim to provide pharma professionals worldwide with freely accessible education and industry insights, and we do it with the help of our incredible partners. And for this webinar, as you might know, our partner is UPRI, a leading provider of efficient solutions to monitor temperature-sensitive assets. And the speakers for this webinar, as I mentioned, Adam Hartman, the co-founder at UPRI, and Jakob Konradsson, the co-founder and head of quality. So with this short introduction, I will give them the stage. Enjoy the session and happy learning.
Hi everyone, thank you Jan for introducing to us, and thanks for having us. We're mega excited to be here, and welcome to our slide adjusted environment here in our headquarters in Copenhagen. You all know what this is about. This is the 5 steps to prepare for an audit. And before we just get started, I don't know, a bit of news from UPRI that we haven't really announced. But, you know, we have our office here in Copenhagen, but we also have our new office in Raleigh in North Carolina. So maybe next time you'll see us there. Let's see, in a different time zone. But regardless, we are here to talk about preparing for an audit. This is something that we do quite often, because not only we prepare for our customers' audits, but we also prepare for all the internal and external auditors that comes in for us. That's why, Jakob, you are kind of like the best suited person I could find at all, because you take so many different places on this table.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. We're in a quite special and interesting situation in that we help a lot of our clients when they are in audits, especially if it's rare that you have audits. It can be something where there's some pitfalls in terms of how you should prepare for an audit, what kind of documentation you need to have ready. So I'm quite excited about this, because this webinar will kind of summarize a lot of the questions we get. We get hundreds of questions each year. What do I need to get ready for my audit? I'm in this situation. What do I do? So I think it would be very interesting to go over some of the things that we are often asked. And then I'm really happy that we're able to convey that information to a lot of people this time. So it's going to be very exciting for sure. I think actually maybe to start off with, we thought about doing a small poll on trying to figure out how often people end up in this situation of having to be prepared for an audit related to temperature compliance. So I think we'll start that off and continue with our presentation, and then we'll get back to some of the results that will be very interesting to see.
Nice. Great. So, and just to, setting the scene basically for who we are here at UPRI. Well, what we do is that back in the days, Jakob and I and a team of engineers from the Technical University of Denmark, we started developing on basically a monitoring and data logging system. But what we realized over this period was that we were working for UNICEF and other like pharma companies, and realized that it wasn't about the particular part about like temperature monitoring necessarily. It was about all the surrounding stuff around this. And that's why we draw this kind of like neat circle out for you guys, because this is what we are today. UPRI is a service provider, basically, that helps you with temperature, humidity, and CO2 monitoring. We help you with validating your equipment, such as like thermal validations. We also have a patent on a calibration method, basically a calibration process that ties particularly to our hardware, which allows you to have like the most speedy calibration at all. And then all in all, what this is about is to make you go through an audit very easy. So that's always been like the kind of like the ground and the boundary condition for what we do in UPRI, and that's why we called it a one-stop solution for temperature compliance.
Absolutely.
So that's why we can talk about this.
Yeah. So today will surely be one in the core of what we do here at UPRI. Yeah. I'd love to do the introduction this time around, maybe, so just to spice things up. So together with me, I have Adam, who has a background in design and innovation engineering. I think that's one of the really key parts of our success is that you and others like you have been able to take in users, to take in our customers and really design a process around compliance rather than just designing products or software. I myself have a background in electrical engineering and instrumentation, and that's why I work with quality today, try to figure out all the process that we have and all our calibration processes. How can we deal with those?
Yeah, and then I always add, because I just love it, when we met each other, you were studying space engineering.
Yes, yeah.
It's so cool when we're launching rockets and people in
Luckily today, I would say temperature compliance is not rocket science. So I think that should be our end goal today. So today, I want to start off actually by saying you're more than welcome to come with questions or comments during this. We'll try to follow up along. We have our screen here so we can see your questions along the way. So don't feel, don't hold back in terms of interrupting me, in terms of coming with great questions. That's always the best part of this presentation, and is when there's a lot of good questions. But basically today we'll go through some pitfalls. Those are the ones we often see our customers falling into when having to deal with temperature compliance. Taking a holistic view of all the processes regarding and then looking at some of the documentation, some of the definitions that need to be in place. And then we'll have some we'll call it 5 steps to get your audit ready. Basically different things, tips and tricks to get you through a temperature compliance audit or any audit really that has temperature compliance as a component. And lastly, we will try to follow up with the day and the webinar and see what kind of questions have been through. So I think maybe first of all, we can take a look at how important is this? How often do you deal with this? So I think this is quite typical that almost half of you guys deal with any sort of audits related to temperature compliance once a year. And that's actually also one of the major pitfalls, not to take in advance, but that it's something that's not dealt with on a monthly basis, or even on a quarterly basis, but something that you go back into and you tend to forget what is kind of documentation is required, what kind of documentation is needed by auditors, and how do you keep track of all of those things. So this is really in line with what we see, that sometimes some of this knowledge gets forgotten or gets stored away, even moving with people. So yeah, you can see once a year increases. So this is very typical, and that makes it even more interesting actually for today. So, but let's head out into it.
Thanks for answering. Okay, let's see.
Yes. So first of all, the pitfalls of temperature monitoring audits or temperature compliance audits. These are sort of the top 5 pitfalls that we see during this audit, which we'll touch base with today. First off, not having performed IQ or QPQ on your data loggers is something that we often see. It tends to be a problem related to leveraging supplier involvement as defined in GAM5, but without having that documented and without having that described, how you performed it or how you chose not to perform initial qualification of your data loggers is something that we'll look into. Also, one that we often see is not having a process for alarms, and this is a twofold. First of all, I think it's very obvious that if you don't know what to do when there's an alarm, if you don't have a process for that, how do you expect people to behave? That's one part of it. And the other part of it is really that we see that auditors expect for you to have processes in place, clearly describing what should happen in the case of a temperature alarm. And that's back to having a temperature compliance audit, related audit once a year. That's also something that it rarely happens. Luckily, it rarely happens that people have a temperature alarm in some sense or have a deviation in that relation. But so that means that it's being forgotten. So that's one of the things I think we should touch base with today. Another thing is rationales relating to alarm settings. That's often one of the things that are also being greatly discussed at the ISPE forum. How should you set alarm limits? What kind of information leads you to those alarm settings? So in other words, what are your rationales for alarm settings? That's one thing that often is not described well enough. So when auditors come by, the knowledge behind why those alarm settings were chosen is not readily available. The fourth thing is really having not having or poorly performed mappings. We see, I think in general, we see an uptake in the expectations from auditors, both from EMA and national institutions, as well as the FDA, in having performed mappings, both in terms of how they're performed, how extensively they're performed, the level of documentation, but also, in my view, we're generally seeing the expectations of temperature mappings being pushed to the GDP section, also with the harmonization of the European GDP and the US GDP on the FDA. We're starting to see mappings becoming a point of interest for auditors. So we'll also touch base on that. And lastly, not having control over calibration certificates, how they are, how they're reviewed, how they're stored. That's surely something that I've often found a bit odd, because it's with the right knowledge, of course, it is actually quite easy to review and control your calibration certificates. So without further ado, I think we'll jump right into how do you avoid these pitfalls and a bit more explanation of these. So, yes, sorry. So first of all, in terms of qualification of data loggers, and I would say not only data loggers, but temperature monitoring system in general, the first thing that we see a lot of our clients tend to fail on during audits that have anything to do with temperature compliance are specifications. Basically, or specification or requirements. What are the requirements for a system? And that really ties back into to process validation, not focusing a lot on what sort of, how should I say, the understanding of temperature storage or temperature control storage is a process. That means that process should be validated. And that leads on to what should be the specification, what should your system be able to do? I mean, I think we can sort of all in the back of an envelope write down that, of course, it should be able to monitor and alarm you and document your temperatures, but be more specific. We see a lot of our customers not having clearly defined requirements. So the top ones at least are, first of all, what are the calibration requirements? I think this is in some case our own fault as well as calibration providers. We've been too good at suggesting calibration points that are typically used in industry, but it's very, very important for you and your organization to have defined what are our specifications and requirements for calibration. What is the maximum permissible error? What calibration points do we need, and what are the rationales behind? Because those are really important to be able to justify that to an auditor.
Isn't that really hard, Jakob, in reality? Because, you know, you have let's say you have 50 fridges, and each of these fridges, they kind of like, they are in 2 to 5 degrees, all of them, but they store different things that are critical at either the high temperature in some or the low in others.
I understand the question. I think in many regards, I mean, fridges tend to be like 2 to 8 degrees, and you have these sections. I think we're all aware that we have your ambience from 15 to 25 degrees. Fridges from 2 to 8, and then frozen below -20, and also ULT freezers between -86 and -60. But I think that's actually the core what you're pointing out. There says, oh, we're used to this, but not having the justification in place to be able to explain to an auditor, this is why we've chosen those calibration points, because it needs to cover this range. That's often somewhere where The thoughts have been done, the thoughts have been thought, but it's not been documented well enough to be able to convey to an auditor.
Maybe that's more of this question is more of like, how do you organize your way out of this?
And absolutely, and that's what we'll get to with the calibration.
Okay, that's really interesting.
I think the second one in terms of specification or requirements is functionalities. What functionalities do you require, both in terms of the data logger and the monitoring system? Do you need alarming? Do you need some sort of statistical tools in there? And those all need to be qualified because they give you an input for a GXP decision. Hence, it's a predicate rule. Hence, it must be validated and in this case, qualified. And therefore, those specifications need to be in place. And lastly, also your process requirements. How do you expect a system, a monitoring system to operate? Do multiple users need to be alarmed? How do you plan to document or store your documentation? How do you plan to store the data? All those things, those requirements needs to be written down and documented. And then lastly, of course, the performing of IQ, OQ, and PQ specifically, and hence also validation needs to be documented. We see a lot of cases where a lot of testing has been done, but the documentation is lacking. So that's really one of the things to keep an eye out for. Moving on here. This is something that in my mind really makes good sense, and that's basically having a process for what happens when you have alarms. As I mentioned before, it rarely happens. I think a related process to this could be, do you know how to use your insurance? I mean, if your house was burned down, do you know who to call? You probably don't, because you don't expect to use your insurance. And in the same way, alarming, especially if you have very stable equipment, we often see that the alarming procedures are not well documented and they are not tested. That's another part of it. So basically, I think it comes down to the question: ask yourself, what would happen if an alarm occurs? And I think a good 80% knows what to do if it's a Monday at 12 noon. Everyone's at work, everyone knows what to do, but also what happens during nights and weekends? Who responds to alarms? First of all, who responds and when do they respond and how do they respond? And secondly, also, there are often different types of alarms that a system can generate. It could be sort of an early warning, that we call it a gray zone alarm. It could also be a critical alarm. Something is actively happening now outside our alarm limits. So how do we deal with these different things? Which alarms require immediate action and which alarms requires sort of more of a review action, seeing if there are any general tendencies? This is often something that's not really anchored down in the organization, especially if you tend not to have that many alarms. So I think it really comes down to two things. First of all, having the SOPs in place. I think this is one that is fairly simple. But the second part is often where we see even more lacking is that how do you train your users? Do you perform any sort of testing of these SOPs? And the auditors often, if you deal with very critical material, they want to see that you've trained in how to deal with alarms, if that is a part of your mitigating procedures in order to keep your process alive and without errors. So that's really something we're starting to see as well. Sort of, well, have you trained what to do and who and when do these things happen?
So what you're saying is also that you should consider to qualify this process.
I mean, you could use the terminology qualify, but I think in terms of practical use, of course, making sure that the SOPs are there in the first place. Okay. I think you're a good 80%, but also training these. I mean, it's one of the successes we often see is creating an artificial alarm. So if you have a spare data logger, take it out of the fridge, see what happens. That's one of the things that makes really good sense in terms of anchoring in the process, making sure that everyone knows what to do. Okay. Just try to get the next one. So alarm settings. This is something that we're often asked. How should I set my alarm settings? And I think a good example is a fridge, as you mentioned. We want to store something between 2 and 8 degrees. So what should my alarm settings be? And there are multiple different ways to do it. I think this really comes down to a risk-based approach. One of the things we see is, I would say, is kind of a pitfall, is that if you have a fridge from 2 to 8 degrees, you will set the alarms at 2 and 8 degrees, the critical alarms. But that also means that you have 0 time to respond. So if you measure 8.5 degrees suddenly, well, it's already too late. So those are some. Is that a risk you're willing to take? And what is the average response time? Let's say a Friday night at 9 o'clock in the evening. What is the response time from you getting that alarm to you actually doing something about it? So first of all, how risk hungry are you? So first of all, having some sort of early warning alarms set in place is a great place to start. And that's sort of the practicalities, but also what are your rationales for choosing those? And there are several different things you need to take into account when setting these alarm settings. First of all, again, the process requirements. What are the requirements from that process? Is it very critical that you store it between exactly 2 and exactly 8 degrees? Or how much deviation can we handle? The NHS have just a few weeks ago published a drug stability tool that's actually very nice to use. So you can enter in the specific drug and you can see the allowed excursion times. So you can use that some sort of as a reference or sort of as an input. But basically, how risk adverse or how risk hungry are you? So what are your actual process requirements? But also what we often see that people tend to forget is the MPE. So you might ask me, Adam, now what is MPE? MPE is basically the maximum permissible error, and that ties back into calibration. So the maximum permissible error takes into account what is the calibration error and what is the calibration uncertainty. So basically, if you have an MPE of plus minus 0.5 degrees, you get it calibrated, your device, and it comes back as passed. It means that with 96% probability, both taking into account the error and the calibration uncertainty, it will measure correctly within plus minus 0.5 degrees. And then you actually have to deduct that from your settings. So if you need to store something between 8.00 degrees and 2.00 degrees, you actually need to set your alarm settings at 2.5 degrees and 7.5 degrees. So taking that into account is actually quite crucial, specifically also when we started talking ULT freezers, where we'll often see a larger MPE of plus minus 1 degree, for example.
So this is where the use requirement specification taps into the alarm setting.
And exactly, it's a really good point. And what we often see as well is that, well, if the requirements for your process are not set, how are you going to set alarm settings? And if you don't have your process requirements, how are you going to choose calibration MPs and calibration points? So it all ties together. And I think really the foundation for a lot of this is setting the requirements correctly and clearly, which also I think what we see in a lot of cases is that it alleviates some of the decision making regarding how to set alarm settings to doing calibration points, because what do we refer to? I mean, do we all, especially if we've got a lot of larger clients where there's a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of different requirements and 50 fridges. If those are set in stone that now we are planning to keep this unit between 2 and 8 degrees, it's more easy for individual units to use those pieces of equipment because they know what they can, what the process boundaries or requirements are. So you can sort of differentiate between harder and softer requirements in terms of the criticality of your goods. And this also ties back into mappings, again, as we'll talk about in a while. I think also another thing to take into account is basically the mapping results. So this is something we see being a large pitfall often. So a mapping report, for example, on a fridge is performed, but the results are often forgotten or tend not to be used. So if you, as an example, when setting alarm limits, you find a hot spot and a cold spot in a fridge, that means that there's variations inside that fridge. And if you place a single logger in there, do you take into account how much different that spot is from the cold spot and the hot spot. So basically that has to be deducted from the alarm settings as well. So of course we can build on with an infinite number of things to take into account, which will shrink down your alarm settings. But I'm not saying that it should be so, but I think we're seeing from auditors that you need at least to have documented your approach to what kind of risk you're willing to take. And then lastly, in terms of alarm settings, also tendencies. So again, if you choose to set a data logger, for example, at your cold spot, but you see the temperatures are generally rising due to aging of equipment, that's fairly normal. Are you still within in the hotspot? Are you then still within the settings? All those different things really have to come into one place, and they really have to be documented. Otherwise, it's sort of meaningless. And I think also we talk slightly about alarm setting in terms of the different types of alarms. There are multiple different systems where you can set early warning alarms and critical alarms and so forth. And from a personal standpoint, I wouldn't feel safe if you didn't have alarm escalation. So really just think about why did you set those alarm settings and what were the inputs for choosing those specific alarm settings. That's really one of the things that we often see is lacking when it comes to specifically institutional auditors.
And then I assume it's back to the webinar we held a couple of weeks ago, maybe it's a month ago. Regardless, we had things like review on that one, because something I experienced is also that, over time you have an expectation to how this kind of equipment, it kind of acts basically. And then things are changing, maybe even the content of the fridge changes. And then this is where, a review is really handy because, just tweaking that a bit to avoid those kind of like false negative alarms and stuff like that, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's also one of the things that we tend to see, I think ties really into what you said in that we often see that alarm settings are set sort of in the initial phase of using any monitoring system, but then they are sort of forgotten and not really reviewed. And as you say, processes might have changed. Equipment tend to fail more often over time. So are they still relevant, those settings?
Yeah. It's just like we see so many customers who really like, they focus on process also, and the process just being, I don't know, slightly off, and it's just not productive for anybody to get these like false negative alarms when it doesn't have any influence on the equipment you have inside, right?
Absolutely. And I think also, so one of the things we're also discussing is the concept of tiring. So if you get a lot of false alarms, it tends to tire out people, and it tends to mean that you don't react on alarms. So those are also some of the human factors I think have to be taken into account, that really tuning your alarm system so that it's not over-analyzing or over-alarming is really something
and that's a mega hard balance, I assume, because you just talked about risk on one side, and then you want to avoid that with getting the alarms and following the process. And how do you balance that out? That's mega hard.
I think you're really right. Also in terms of the risk associated with tiring is often not taken into account, because as a quality responsible myself, I know that often the easiest decision is just to say we'll have more control in place, and it's often easier personally to justify having more alarms than fewer, but we often tend to forget the human element of getting too many false alarms. So a really good point, absolutely. Yes, so another point is perform mappings again, because what we sometimes see is that there are either poorly performed mappings or not mappings performed at all. I can see we're just missing. We'll have the screen up and ready in just a second. But I think the first point in terms of having proper mapping is actually defining a mapping or validation strategy. This is something that we see auditors tend to focus on more. Why were specific mapping scenarios chosen? Why was the extent of the mapping set in the way that it was? And I think some of the core elements to choosing a good mapping strategy should not be a very detailed one, but at least it should identify when do we perform mappings, what is our rationales for choosing when to do revalidations or remappings, and how should you do it. Not in a detailed way on a sort of more a strategy approach, but at least having a foundation for how do you choose mapping points, how do you show the auditors that you have control over the extent of your mapping. That's really important. And secondly as well, what is your usable volume? That really means being aware of that mostly is relevant for warehouses or bigger units, but basically which parts of your warehouses or storage rooms and so forth are actually qualified or validated for storing sensitive goods. This is often something that where we see a sort of an easy pitfall would be that if it's not clearly defined or clearly marked even on the floors, can be quite physical, marking out where can I place sensitive goods and where can I place non-sensitive goods. There's often a tendency for the auditors to say, how can you ensure that sensitive products are not placed in an area that hasn't been validated? Often also what we see in terms of temperature mappings is that they do not cover the usable volume. So the volume that you're going to use, the mappings are sort of performed in some areas of the warehouse, but not in the rest, and how that inflicts the mapping result. And then lastly, an advice at least is to use risk assessments for revalidations. This is something I've been a part of a great discussion on the ISP forum at least, in terms of how often should you do remappings. And there are many great contributions to whether you should do it based on risk or time or both, and there's a lot of debate. But I think some of the pitfalls that we see is that those risk assessments are not done. So there are several different approaches. Of course, I think it's industry standard and expected by auditors to do it when you have large changes in either processes or equipment. But if none of those changes are made, how do you then decide how often you want to remap? And we could give an entire talk on that topic alone, but I think it's just one of the things we see is that you haven't documented those rationales, and those risk assessments haven't been documented. And in my opinion, it goes a long way to just at least document those risks in order to sort of define when to do remappings.
Jakob, I just did something very fast out of the pocket, right? Just asked, like, do you actually perform mappings out there? And it was just like, yeah, you guys really do mappings. That's really good to hear. So maybe you even have like some good points on this that you want to share with us in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Moving on here. So, yes, great. So one of the other parts here is really to control the calibration certificates, and not only the calibration certificates, but the calibration process. One of the things we see which tend to catch the focus of an auditor is whether you've done review on your calibration certificates. And we often see that, well, okay, we'll start doing review. And then the second question from the auditor is, what are your requirements for your calibration? Which calibration points did you choose and why? And this is something that, in my mind at least, should be sort of baseline thinking in terms of setting requirements for a process. But I also understand that we can also see a lot of customers have difficulties in understanding how to set calibration points, how to set MPE, as we talked about, how precise should my equipment be. We even see customers, I think, sort of on the opposite, who set them very, very tightly, who expect very, very precise equipment for processes that do not really require really, really precise equipment. So first of all, setting your requirements, that follows what calibration points, and in general, your calibration points should cover, we won't go into much detail, but your calibration points should cover from below your operation temperature to above your operation temperature, and one sort of in the middle, or you can cover a larger range if we're talking a fairly small range of temperatures. And then also setting what should the MPE be. So basically, how precise should or accurate should my equipment be?
I assume a review, like, yeah, but isn't it also like these nitty-gritty stuff that like reviewing if the reference that was used, or do you just always trust that, you know, we are an accredited calibration company? So do you just trust us, or do you actually need to do review on a company like us?
It's a really good question. I think one of the advantages of choosing an accredited calibration laboratory is that review is already being done yearly on a yearly basis by an independent third party.
So that's something you can relay back to the auditor and say like, yeah, this is actually reviewed. Then you can review the the body
I think some of the more appearing missing reviews are often related to, have you actually investigated the certificate, and does it have the results that you expected it to have? So was your MPE below what you expected the MPE to be below? And is the certificate actually the certificate for the specific unit you have in your hand when you're doing the review? Those are fairly simple reviews to perform, but often we're seeing them not being performed and not being documented. And then secondly, again, back to documentation, having control over your calibration certificates. Where do you store those calibration certificates? Are they stored so that they're easily retrievable and they eliminate risk of errors when retrieving those? So do you get to store or retrieve an old calibration certificate, for example, or one for a different unit? So really having all those calibration certificates in one place is one of the key things I would go for, at least.
Because it's easy also in the audit to just get it all very fast, or why is it actually nice?
I think one of the key elements to why having control over calibration certificates and having them easily reviewable during an audit is because my personal theory is that during an audit it's such an easy thing to check. I mean, it doesn't require a very deep understanding into the process requirements, but because it's fairly easy to say, is there a calibration certificate, and have you understood what's in it for an auditor? So that's always something that I think we've all experienced during audits, that auditors don't have the time to go through everything. So they will try to find points of interest, which they'll dig deeper into. So the calibration certificate is something that if you can't find it, or you don't know where it's stored, it's a place that an auditor would find interest in and really try to dig into.
Yeah, and because it ties back to something that you realized over the years that we've talked about once in a while, is when you have an audit, you kind of like everything is digital.
Yeah.
So you have obviously prepared everything that you need, but if they want to drift away, then they drift. And you drift with them, and the experience that you have with the auditor is just like you have an open dialogue, and I'm so amazed by that. Like suddenly it changes, the atmosphere changes because you have it documented digitally, so you can just say, yeah, of course you can see that. Yeah, of course you can see that.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly change the entire setting of the audit from being, you know, we're sitting here and we're being controlled to like we're really moving something. We're really trying to like help each other.
Absolutely, and I think also I think calibration certificates are a thing that's very easy to have in control, and therefore I think it's also an understanding that, of course, not everyone working within the pharma industry can have a deep understanding of calibration and the calibration process, and I think that's fair. So if you want to avoid the auditor using too much time on thermal compliance, I think this is just an easy thing to say, yes, this is the system we have, this is how it's qualified, these are the system, these are the loggers, this is how they're calibrated, and that's based on our calibration and validation strategy. Boom. That will not be a point of interest anymore for an auditor. So that they're really having those.
And it's also, you know, you have typically so many fridges, you have so much data, it's so easy to, you know, to be, not trusting that you have that in control. If you just find something small here and there, or you can't find the data or locate, because there's just so much data, right?
Absolutely. And I think also often one of the pitfalls is that we tend to outsource calibration activities, and therefore I think it's fair that the understanding of the calibration process is sort of outsourced, but at least you need to show. That's at least what we see with customers. They tend to put too much trust in the calibration provider, in the sense that, of course, it should be trusted and should have selected those. but it also sets some requirements for you to do at least spot reviews of what they're providing to you. And if you don't know what that should be compared to with your requirements, how can you review it? Yeah.
That's a good point. And I just wanted to pull up the poll that I just did while you talked, Jacob. Like what is the benchmark of the audience here? Are you doing like accredited calibrations or let's say the traceable calibrations like what NIST is kind of covering, or other, because I know it's different all over Europe also. But it seems like 77% of all is actually performing a accredited calibration, let's say under a body like A2LA or DAX or something like that, or UCAS in England.
Yeah. I think one term that I often tend to sort of set in stone is that both an accredited calibration and a non-accredited calibration can both be traceable. Accredited calibration must be traceable, otherwise it's not accredited. But calibrations the accreditation really comes down to trust and being able to prove and document that the calibration activities have been performed in accordance with ISO 17025. One term at least that's really important to get in place is that there are no place in the GXP area where you can have non-traceable calibrations. They all need to be traceable to the International System of Standards. Whether those are performed at an accredited or non-accredited calibration laboratory kind of does not matter, but they still have to be traceable.
The part about reviewing is just easier.
Yeah, I mean, the extent at which you need to do supply evaluation, supply audits, however you choose to do it is really large when having non-accredited laboratories, but you can also choose that there are no critical rules for using accredited laboratories in either the Code of Federal Regulation or in the GDP or the GXP.
I also assume that it's that it's not bad to say that whatever, if it's not under the ISO 17025, I assume from a metrology kind of standpoint that you have a bit more freedom to kind of decide something that doesn't apply to the accredited laboratories, but it's still actually quite good.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing about ISO 17025 is that it's with the new revision of the ISO 17025, they basically said the first half, 2/3 are ISO 9001, and you can directly compare those, and the last third are the technical requirements. So in that sense, all the different quality requirements that we would ask of a calibration provider also covers ISO 9001, and we also expect them to have the technical capabilities to perform calibrations at the level that you're claiming. I think a good point is that often accreditation is associated with high levels of quality in terms of calibrations. It's a high level of quality in the sense that those are controlled, but actually the major point is that the stated calibration uncertainty has been proven and has been audited. You can have a calibration uncertainty of 100 degrees and still be accredited. Those are really not correlated, but it basically means you can trust the results and you can trust the calibration uncertainty.
And that's hence like that you actually have a kind of decent understanding of what you're looking at when you're looking at a calibration certificate. Yeah. But even though it's accredited, you might still have an MP that's totally off.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to again that one of the pitfalls is say, I used an accredited calibration laboratory. That's fine, but what MP was chosen? So really, yeah.
All right.
And I think as a fun last example, I always tend to ask when you get a question is, do we need accredited calibrations? And you don't need them per se, but I give the example of if your seatbelt in your car or your airbag your brakes in your car, if your brakes were broken, would you go to any mechanic and get it fixed, or would you go to someone who's actually qualified for doing the job?
Got it.
Yeah.
So instead of just asking my uncle to fix it,
yes, exactly.
I would actually go
I
down
would
to
probably go down to the certified mechanics because it's such an important part of it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's technically reasonable to suspect that a calibration laboratory would have results that are comparable and traceable, but basically it's a really key part of maintaining a compliant process.
And then another thing is like, because we come back to this point all the time that you said, whenever you start up a new kind of unit and fridge or freezer or a new kind of process, you do it very well early. And then over the years, it either develops or it stays as it is. The thing about an accredited laboratory is that it kind of, it has to develop accordingly to the accreditation.
Yeah, I think that comes with all certifications as well, ISO 9000.
Somebody's looking over you.
Yeah, absolutely. It has a lot to do with trust. Great. Well, thank you very much, guys. I was wondering if there are any sort of questions. I think we can try to summarize on some of this.
Jakob, just let's see if something comes in on the chat, and you're very welcome to just fire along. Maybe we even have a couple of questions from you guys, and we will pull it in the poll also. But I had something that you said during the presentation here. This part about the NHS actually having a reference guide. I know, you're out there, you're coming from all over the world, and some is in FDA world and some is in India world. But this, like a body from the United Kingdom that actually states like this kind of guide is very
I think they published a tool which collects data from the individual suppliers, in which their stability studies are summarized, basically.
Sure.
But it gives a very nice indication of because we're often being asked, well, how long a deviation can I handle?
That's it.
What's okay? And first of all, it's very difficult for us to answer because we don't have the product-specific knowledge. But it's basically back to the stability studies of the drugs being used or the sensitivity. And I think that tool is a very good starting point. I mean, we don't store any drugs here at our place, so we don't have to use it directly, but it's a very good starting point for the finding. But I think the baseline in any sense is documenting what do you expect, or what should that process live up to? How large a deviation in temperature and for how long can you handle?
And this is where, the risk part really comes into picture. And I know you guys out there, you are like probably pharmaceutical companies or likewise. And you have the stability studies yourself. But even then, it's still quite hard to take a decision on this. So basically what I'm searching for is also the benchmark between the companies and how is this being shared. And this is the first time I've at least seen a way to kind of collect this on a kind of like benchmark big scale. But maybe some of you out there have other benchmarks like this that you could share with us in the group. If you know anything, please be free to open up in the chat.
So some different questions. I think first one from Ajit, thank you very much. What should be the frequency to verify the alarms? That's a really good question. I think it's sort of the same process that relates to remappings. It should be based on a risk-based approach, and what then the next question is, what are the inputs for that risk-based approach or risk assessment? Basically, one of the things we often see is that if you have alarms that are tied to specific people, individual cell phones or individual email accounts and so forth, if you tend to have a large turnover, that would be an input for that risk assessment. The other parts are, of course, the system itself. Does it have any sort of ongoing generated alarms or status messages that tells you that the system is operational? That's for sure. So it's hard to give an exact number in terms of how often you should verify the alarms, but I think a good approach is to look at the process, who, when and how, and look at the specific system. Do you get ongoing "I'm still alive" messages, or does it have built-in controls that ensure that it still operates?
And to Stephen Ola, let's have a talk about this particular problem afterwards, because this is absolutely something that you can have installed correctly. to get it fixed, this is exactly what we do. So we can definitely help you with fixing this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a good question here from Dirk. Besides EU GDP 213 and 343 or 1, what other regulations or reference standards include information expectations regarding temperature mapping? So there are some great ones. I think first of all, starting with the WHO Technical Guide number 7, I think it's called. You can search for WHO mapping online. It gets a really nice introduction in what the expectations for mappings are, mostly in relation to warehouses. But an even more thorough one is the ISP controlled chamber temperature mapping and monitoring guideline. It's at a cost. It costs something, but it gives a really nice, very thorough description on how you should map different units, such as warehouses down to smaller fridges and freezers. And often we see auditors having that as a baseline for how to evaluate whether a mapping has been performed according to standards.
Is that both on both sides of the Atlantic Sea?
Yes, that's internationally accepted in my sense. Those are sort of the major ones. And then there are some that go into more technical detail. But in terms of the expectations of how well performed the mapping should be, I would say the WHO guideline and the ISP guideline are really good.
Nice.
What other questions do we have here? So what is the approach to qualifying data loggers and providers? Sorry, Andrea, if I'm misinterpreting the questions, but interpret at least how to qualify data loggers. I would say, first of all, making sure requirements or specifications are set in stone. Looking at the whole system, what should the whole system be capable of doing? So if you both have a data logger component and a software component, or a sensor component and software component, what should that be able to do? IQ, is it installed correctly? I think that's fairly simple. Looking at calibration certificates, initial calibrations. Looking at, when we perform qualification of our system, having a configuration item list that is an ongoing document. So at least you have somewhere where you've defined how should this system be set up in terms of alarms, in terms of users, in terms of other specifications to the specific system, because we often see that tends to be buried somewhere deep in the system, all these different settings. But when you're doing a review, what do you review it against? And that should basically be your configuration item list. Operational qualification, basically making sure that it connects, that there's a valid connection, that it can create alarms both at low temperatures and high temperatures at different scenarios, that there are correct people get the alarms, that the system measures within the measurement frequency and so forth. And often, actually, we tend to make the PQ a review of documentation and processes. So has there been developed training material for the system, or at least a training process? Do you know what to do in case of alarms, as we touched base with? Are all these different things incorporated into the quality management system? So those are some of the things. So yeah, I see there's one Ahmed for asking how many years we should retain calibration certificates. So we're working with many different industries. We normally call it GXP compliance, what we do. So we deal with both pharma distribution and production, but also biopharma and a lot of different things. So my answer is going to be quite vague. But in general, the predicate rule is that you need to attain documentation for any pharmaceutical product that is still in market or doing stability. So basically, I think that the rule of thumb is that as long as you would make a decision based on a drug that's in the market off of some data, that is when you should retain the calibration certificate. So your batch records, look at how long to retain those. The lab records, how long time do you retain those? And at least in that period of time, calibration certificates should be made. Remember that calibration certificates is something that you use to make a GXP-based decision on, just as well as batch records. So it's in that category.
Yeah, and to give an example, we have customers who paid us for 20 years of data holdover to also answer that question. Like that was their approach at least.
It really also really comes down to when is that data still applicable?
Yeah.
And it's that sense. Again, remember the data logger data is worthless without a calibration certificate for sure. I see we also have a lot of questions regarding how often a temperature mapping should be done, or some tend to call it a revalidation. And that's something that causes huge debate. I can only urge that people join the ISP and the part of the forum in that there's really some great discussions ongoing. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier. If there are any changes to equipment, so that as an example for fridges, do you change the door ceilings? Is the compressor changed? Is the fridge changed entirely? For warehouses, do you change equipment, doors? Those are changed. A revalidation or remapping needs to be performed, but also a change of processes. So we've had cases where mapping was performed for a fridge or a freezer that was used for storing products. They were stored there for stability studies, so they were stored there for a very long time without the door being opened. But at some point in time, the process was changed. Now this fridge or this freezer needs to be used for freezing. So that's something entirely different. It's being used in a totally other way. The doors will be opened much more, the thermal load in there will be much more, so that requires a revalidation. And the most question is, I've done none of this thing, I've done no changes, how often should you change, or should you perform remapping? And that's a really good question. In my experience, the industry standard is somewhere between every third and fifth year for both for larger units and smaller units. But basically, it also comes down to looking at tendencies. Do you see temperatures changing over time? Having a physical inspection of the unit as well. Often for fridges, the door seals tend to go bad and tend to drift over time. So definitely something to look at.
So again, the older the equipment is, the more frequent it is, and all of those normal things. Yeah.
Yes, but it is very, very difficult to understand or to get a grasp of what the rationale should be. Absolutely.
Got it. All right. I think we are very close to be at the end of this webinar. As always, it's so incredibly joyful, Jakob, to be here with you. I actually, even though I've been in this business for many years, I still learn stuff every day. Yeah. It's about these like small nuances that is in this kind of connection between something super technical like devices and equipment, both cooling equipment or heating equipment, and then the logging equipment, and then this compliance side. It is really complex. It's a lot about like it's human power also, right?
Yeah, and that really, one of the things I love is also that when we're talking alarms as an example, it's a really human side to it. You get tired of too many false alarms, but on the other end, your process need to be very clear. It's a truly anthropological study almost sometimes to get all these processes involved in the business, and that's one of the things that takes the human element into quality in my mind at least. Yeah.
Nice. Well, and that's what's to be said here. Remember, like to reach out to us at UPRI on our phone or on our mail on our website. This is exactly what we do. We help in making audits really easy. Actually, it's super quick to just export audit-ready documentation from our system, our monitoring platform, and even our mapping platform. So check it out on our website, and then have a chat with some of our product specialists who would be so much willing to show it to you guys. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Jan, for having us again at your show. It's really impressive with all the people that we can attract for this, and I really hope you also enjoyed it out there. Thank you so much for coming. So Jan, it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. So again, as usual, very fascinating lecture, great duo dynamic which you have there. I see always same also people who revisit our webinars, and I hope they really enjoyed. I put in the chat our 2 upcoming webinars that we already have planned. So they are great. People love them. So we see the potential here, and I'm grateful to you, the UPRI team, that you take your time, you come, you talk to the people, share your knowledge, and teach the GMP community. So thank you very much for that, and our great audience. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at our upcoming events this and next year. So have a great evening ahead of you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys.